Hello everyone, this is Shannon from That's So Poe, and today I'm bringing you week 4 of my 2019 reads. So week 4 was great. I'm really enjoying my reads this month. I will mention, before I get into all of my reads, that I have had a very good reading month and I've given very high ratings to everything that I've been reading, and that's not necessarily typical for me to rate this highly. So I just wanted to mention that I don't give out 5s as easily as I have been this month. It's just been I've had a ton of amazing books. Also, I do want to mention that I have DNF'd 2 books this month. I just don't talk about the DNFs that I have. I don't count them for anything that I'm tracking. So it's not that I haven't read any books that I don't like. It's just that the books that I have finished have been particularly good. So the first book that I finished this week was Jackalope Wives and Other Stories by T. Kingfisher. And this, I have to do a big thank you to Maija from Maija Reads, because she did a video during Vlogmas about SFF short story recommendations, and she linked the Grandma Harkin short stories by T. Kingfisher in her description. And because of that, my husband and I went and we read those over winter break and loved them so much that we bought the collection, and we have been reading those short stories since winter break and absolutely loving these stories. They are so good. Also, Rachel at Kalanadi has definitely recommended this collection before, so to both of them, thank you for talking about how great this short story collection is, because it really is wonderful. It's so wonderful, in fact, that I'm not going to talk about it too much here. I'm going to do a separate video with my husband. And this also thank you to Bex and Jon at KnightHunter Books. They have a joint channel where they talk about books together that is absolutely wonderful, and I've totally wanted to do something with my husband as well, but he wasn't so into it. They suggested I ask if he just wanted to do maybe one video, and since he loved Jackalope Wives so much, he agreed to do a video with me. So that'll go up later this week. But just to give a brief description of it here, Jackalope Wives and Other Stories is a collection of fairy tale, folk tale type stories, often with a little bit of a darker twist. And what is so unique about these is that T. Kingfisher does an amazing job in just a couple of pages of building an entire world and very complex characters, where even if you only see the character's viewpoint for a couple of paragraphs, you really get drawn into who they are. You understand them as a person. And all the characters are very complex and very interesting. There is especially, which always works for me, a focus on strong female characters, and they are strong in a very no-nonsense, practical, let's just get stuff done type of way that I really, really connect to. And a ton of these characters are older women, retired women, older witches or fairies, and it's just so, so great. So I will talk more about this in the video that I do with my husband, but as always, if I love a book this much, it gets 5 out of 5 stars. The next book that I finished is also due to a recommendation by Bex and Jon at KnightHunter Books. And everybody that I mentioned, by the way, I will have links to their channels below. Bex and Jon had talked about Monstress, and that caused me and my husband to read volumes 1 and 2. This week I finished Monstress volume 3 by Marjorie and Takeda, and it was amazing. Absolutely amazing. This series is maybe a little bit outside of my comfort zone because it is very dark. It's very gruesome at times. There's a lot of blood and gore and violence, but the artwork is probably the most beautiful artwork I have ever seen. It's just this gorgeous steampunk, Art Deco, Art Nouveau, Asian-inspired World War I. It's just absolutely gorgeous art. The characters are basically almost all women. There are men in the story, but they are very much supporting side characters. Almost all of the main characters are women. Almost all of the leaders, the generals of the armies, almost all the characters are women and are very, very strong. And this world is a dark world all about war and racism and the kind of politics and ulterior motives and spies. It is a complex, very dark world, but it is so engaging. And I think in volume 3, you start to really question everything that's going on. Everything is a bit of a mystery, and in each volume you start to unravel a little bit more, but sometimes as you unravel more, it just answers very little while opening up so many more questions. So in this volume, you start to question everybody's motives. You start to question everything that each character thinks they understand. So it's very engaging and very dark, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, I'm not sure. But it's a great installment, and I cannot wait for volume 4. So for volume 3, I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. The next book I finished was a collection of poems, and this is my first poetry collection of the year. This is one of my goals, to read at least 10 collections of poems, so I was very pleased about that. I read The Dream Keeper and Other Poems by Langston Hughes, and this was really interesting. I'd heard of Langston Hughes, but I'd never read anything of his, and this poetry collection was intended for young readers, so especially for Black youth. And I think this was written in more like the early 1900s, 1925, 1935, something around there. And the stories are very interesting collection of inspirational stories. So a lot about having dreams and pursuing them, and having strong goals and not giving up. But there's also a lot of acknowledgement of the difficulties faced by Black youth and by having a society that's not necessarily in your favor. There's also a lot of blues. So he has some poems that are done in a blues manner, and there's a lot of difficulty and mourning in those poems. So I really enjoyed this collection. His poetry style is very to the point, in a sense. It's very short verses, very simple in some ways in terms of it's not like overly flowery, but there's a lot of meaning packed beneath those very few lines. And I wanted to read one short poem just to give you an example of what I mean. So this poem was called Sea Calm. How still, how strangely still the water is today. It's not good for water to be so still that way. It's a very short poem, but I feel like it somehow still reaches you and makes you think and relate that to your life. What are those things where it's almost more scary that nothing is happening? And I think all of us have felt that at some point in our lives, where we're waiting for the bad thing to happen, the other shoe to drop. So I think that his poetry was just that very interesting mixture of something simple on the surface, but maybe a lot more depth underneath. Overall, I thought that the poems were very good. I liked a lot of them. There were quite a few that I really connected to, but many of them were maybe not intended for me. I'm not, I guess, a young Black reader, but I really liked these poems, and I gave this collection 4 out of 5 stars. The last book I finished was a very challenging book for me. So I finished Kindred by Octavia Butler. And this was something that I had chosen as part of my Kwanzaa-Reflect-A-Thon 2019 to be read list. So if you haven't seen my video, I will link it below. I had chosen 7 books to read over the course of 2019 in order to do the Kwanzaa-Reflect-A-Thon in December. And again, if you haven't seen that video, I'll link below as well Njeri from ONYX Page's announcement about Kwanzaa-Reflect-A-Thon for 2018. And that's kind of where I got this idea of how to use the principles of Kwanzaa, which focus on things like unity and collaborative work and creativity, to understand books and just sort of a lens to reflect more deeply about what I read. So I had chosen a book for each principle. And for Unity, I chose Kindred because the storyline is about a woman, Dana, in the 1970s who is Black, and she gets pulled back in time. She's completely not in control of it, to 1815 Maryland, where her ancestor, who's a white slave owner, keeps getting in trouble and almost dying, and she has to save him in order to sort of preserve her genetic line. And I thought, oh, this would be a really interesting story looking at, you know, this idea of unity between somebody who is really at odds with the other person that they're saving in terms of life experience and beliefs and values. I had an inkling that maybe my choice was an interesting one when Njeri had commented on my video saying, let me know how that goes. It was not what I expected at all. So definitely, the premise was the premise. That was what was happening. But I expected a much easier story, which was about how to overcome those differences. And that was not what I got. So what I got was something where Octavia Butler really does not give you any easy answers. Everything is something that you need to kind of work through on your own. There's no, in a sense, there's no real true answers or value judgments or morality choices that are correct in this book. Everything is a bit of a give and a take. It's a complex situation where the characters are all trying very hard to do whatever they think makes sense, but they're all struggling with their own complex experiences in their life and how that forms them. And especially because this book takes place in the past over a multitude of years, you see a lot of the characters in Maryland change over time and how they're influenced by those experiences they have, and how sometimes that can really warp a person. And Dana is in a very interesting situation where she has ties to her her ancestor who was the slave owner. She has ties to her modern day husband who is white. She has ties also to the Black slaves on the plantation through community as well as through other reasons. And how she balances those ties, how she makes a decision about whose side she's going to take, who's she going to help, what if one of those people is hurting one of the other people, what boundaries does she draw? And there's a lot of issues of how do you care about somebody who at the same time is hurting you in various ways. So there's a lot of complex relationship issues centering around abuse and around love and difficult in a very difficult, complex relationship. And I finished this book and was just stunned. I didn't know what to think. I had devoured it. It was so engaging. You just turned the page and what happens next, what happens next. But at the end, it was so interesting because Butler gave me no answers. It was just a lot of things to process and think about and try to make sense of. You know, I guess in a way, there was an essay at the end of the book talking about sort of an academic review of what was going on in the book. And in there, it's one of those ideas of Butler had said that slavery was not something that could be made sense of. And so a lot of this book follows that. You can't make sense of a lot of what happened. And that's a very unique experience for me in my reading. I don't think I have generally read too many books that challenge me in that way. The best way I can describe it is to talk about maybe the first time I tried coffee. You know, the first time I tried coffee, it was very much, I don't know how I feel about this drink. It's very bitter. It's not easy to drink in the way that like a soda or a milkshake or something like that is. And it took me a while to become accustomed to that bitterness and appreciate the depth of flavor and the interest that it had. And so I think this book is something that maybe I even need to reread and think more about. It was complex, but very, very good. And I will be thinking about it for the rest of this year so that in December when I do my Kwanzaa-Reflect-A-Thon, I can really think more deeply about the issue of unity and what exactly I'm getting out of this book. So it's very complex, but really well worth the read. So I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. So that was my reading week. It was a great, if very thought-provoking week, and I hope that you guys have had a great reading week as well. If you've read any of these books or you have any thoughts, please comment below and let me know. They're really interesting books and there's a lot to think about, so I'd love to hear other people's opinions as well.